Let's just turn to some words of Jesus. And today we're going to be in the trial before the council. And we're going to see some of Jesus' most pointed words about who he is. You know, so many times, I think in a way that sometimes has frustrated me, Jesus just doesn't take every opportunity to tell people who he is. There's this whole thing, especially in the book of Mark, that's referred to as the messianic secret. You know, Jesus heals somebody and says, don't tell anybody what's happened to you. Don't tell anybody who I am. And it's really not until he gets to Jerusalem where he's really revealed to the masses. And we kind of see why it leads to his crucifixion. But even in these trials, as he's talking to Pilate yesterday, as he's being kind of cryptic, my kingdom's not of this world. And, you know, you just wish sometimes he would stop and say, listen, I am the Son of God. Do what you want with that, but this is the truth. And, you know, even a lot of his teaching was in parables. Why? So people wouldn't get it. That's a weird thing to think through, why Jesus taught that way so many times. But here before the council, he's not before Pilate. He's not before the Roman cohort. He's not before the masses. He is before the people who stand in as the counselors of Israel, as the ones in charge in Jerusalem, the Pharisees and Sadducees that make up the Sanhedrin. And Jesus is being charged not to see if he has broken a civil law, but rather he is being charged to see whether or not he's a blasphemer. And so at first, so we'll be in Mark chapter 14, and we're just going to read a couple of verses maybe 62 and 63. But he's brought before the Sanhedrin. Now, these are the people that are waiting for the Messiah. See, Rome's not waiting for a Messiah. The nations around them are not waiting for a Messiah. But these are the men that claim to be waiting for a Messiah, waiting for the Christ of God, the Christ of the blessed, as this verse will say. And so there before them stands the one that they are waiting for. And but see, their hearts, you can tell in the trial that their hearts are not searching for truth. Their hearts are just searching to condemn him, just to crucify Jesus. That's all they really have in their heart. And so what they do is they bring in some worthless guys that are going to lie and give false testimony. And so, you know, the scriptures say they can't get their story straight. They tell a story about Jesus saying he was going to tear down the temple, and another guy comes in and tells a similar story. But the scriptures are pretty, actually, I think, kind of clever and funny to say even these liars, they couldn't get their story straight. And so then finally the council decides to, first of all, offer Jesus the chance to defend himself. You hear what these men are saying about you and what you said about the temple. What do you have to say for yourself? And it says Jesus is silent. Again, there are always going to be people saying things about Jesus. Jesus feels no obligation to say, "Nuh-uh, he's lying. I didn't really say that. He misunderstood." There's no obligation in Jesus to justify who he is or what he says. He doesn't need to defend himself. But then the council makes a decision to directly ask Jesus who he is. And guys, this is the point of the Gospel of Mark. This is the point of all of the Gospels. Who exactly is Jesus? Because let me tell you, we should not follow Jesus unless he is God. We absolutely, if this is all false hope, if this is all, well, we just have a philosophy of, you know, we were born into the church, or, you know, we find comfort in prayer, or forget all that, man. Like that, those are byproducts of the truth. If Jesus isn't God, then do not follow him. So the Sanhedrin asked Jesus very plainly. Matthew 26 says it like this. It says that they said, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Mark 14 records their words like this: "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Verse 61 of chapter 14 says, yeah, But he remained silent and made no answer. And again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Man, you've got the right guy asking the right question with the wrong heart. He's got the Christ right there in front of him. He's the leader of the Jewish people. You know, Jesus died for the sins of the whole world, Jew and Gentile alike, and that's a wonderful thing to rejoice. But we could spend a minute grieving over the fact that he came to his people, to the Jewish people, and was rejected even by their leaders, by the high priest. "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" he asked him. And Jesus said, "I am. I am." We've done it before and we could do it again in some other video, but just the power behind the words, "I am." Jesus looks him straight in the eye and goes, "Now we're getting to the point. Don't crucify me because I said something about the temple, or because you don't understand where power comes from, or whatever else, that I'm a threat to your power. Don't worry about all that. But if you're asking me, am I the Son of God, the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? I am." And then, Jesus spends just a minute commenting on that too. And it's interesting that he doesn't prove that by saying, "Well, you saw the miracles I did. Why don't you go talk to Lazarus? Ask him who I am. Ask Mary and Martha who I am," as they watch their brother walk out of a tomb and shed his grave clothes. "Why don't you ask the 5,000 people I fed on a hillside? Or why don't you ask my disciples? Or why don't you ask the blind that have gained sight? Or why don't you ask some of your own scribes who say that I teach with authority?" See, they had already seen all that. That's exactly who they were rejecting. They had seen him cast out demons and said, "Oh, I think he casts out demons by the power of Beelzebub." They had seen the testimonies of Lazarus and said, "Jesus has to die." They had accepted, they had paid 30 pieces of silver to accept the betrayer who came from his own disciples. They had seen all of the evidence, but all they wanted to do was kill him. Man, what do you want to do with Jesus? Do you want him to just be the miracle worker? Do you want him to be the place where you find some comfort? Or are you willing to accept that he is God the Son? So Jesus looks this guy in the eye, and in just some of the clearest teaching about who he is you will ever hear, he says this. Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Mark, as much as any of the Gospels, Matthew maybe even more, but there's always an eschatological eye. There's always especially I think because it is written to an oppressed people, there's always this thing of well, how's all this going to wrap up? Is God really the king that brings everything into order at some point? Are we bending towards his rule and reign at some point? And what does that mean for us now to live in the kingdom of heaven? And so Mark records these words of Jesus saying, "You want to know if I'm the Christ?" And by the way, when they were asking, "Are you the Christ?" there was nothing but clarity in the room. They weren't asking, "Are you a good teacher?" They weren't asking, do you have a direct line to God? They knew what they were asking. Are you the anointed one, the Messiah, the one in the line of David, the one who the prophets talked about? Are you the Savior? Are you God? And so Jesus says, "I am, and I'll tell you another thing. You'll see the Son of Man," that reference back to Old Testament prophecy to Daniel. "You'll see the Son of Man riding into town on the clouds at the right hand of power." Capital P, God. Jesus is so clear about who he is. You know, I think we wander off into doubt, into disappointment. We wander off into fear when we simply forget who Jesus is. Guys, at this time of the year, as we're, getting our hearts ready to celebrate the resurrection, we aren't celebrating a tradition. We aren't celebrating a culture. In fact, this year, Easter is going to look very different than it's ever looked in my other 46 years of life. But we aren't celebrating, pretty dresses and sharp ties and Easter egg hunts. And we're not even celebrating saying he is risen indeed. And we're not celebrating gathering together as a church on Easter. Those are the ways we celebrate. But what we are celebrating is God himself become a man so that he would die, so that you might not have the fear of death and the grave, that might not be the final answer, but rather that you would know that Jesus of Nazareth, the crucified one at the hands of Pontius Pilate, convicted by the Sanhedrin in the story we just read, that he is coming again, that he is God the Son, that he is the only one worthy of our praise. The chief priests, after Jesus said this, responded in one of only two ways that is proper to respond. He tore his clothes and he said, "Do we need any more evidence? You've heard this blasphemer right now. He's got to go." And let me tell you, that is the appropriate response if Jesus isn't God. If Jesus isn't God, then not only don't follow him, but reject him completely. But if Jesus is God, then the only other response is fall at his feet. The only other response is to serve him. The only other response is to say, I will pledge my whole life to you. Apathy is not an appropriate response. If you have tradition, if you have self-centered religion in your heart, it's not the proper response. You either reject him or you live for him in his kingdom. But make no mistake, Jesus' answer for, hey, are you the Christ, the Son of God, was an emphatic, I am.